Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. Dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. Aim small, miss small. For many Americans, the Patriot is the image of the Revolutionary War in the South, militia ambushes in swamps, and a relentless British army marching through the Carolina backcountry. While the film takes plenty of liberties with history, it gets one thing right. By the final years of the Revolution, the South would determine whether the war was won or lost. But that wasn't always the case. For most of the war, the fighting took place in the northern states. That changed by 1780, when British leaders opted for a Southern campaign as a final attempt to end the rebellion. To explore this campaign, we're joined by...
I'm Bert Dunkerley. I'm a historian here in Richmond, Virginia, study the Revolution and Civil War, authored several books, and I'm pretty active in historic preservation and events that are going on with the 250th.
As we've seen throughout the podcast, before 1780, most of the Revolutionary War had been fought in the northern colonies, around places like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were active participants, sending men, money, and supplies to support the Patriot cause. But they'd seen relatively little fighting in their own states.
Georgia is very small population, young colony, really not a lot to it other than Savannah and Augusta. The South Carolina has its wealth and its economic engine is rice, indigo, and cash crops like that. North Carolina, large population, but fairly poor and no major cities. Virginia is really the big player in the South, and its economy is driven by tobacco production. And Virginia is supporting the war effort by exporting tobacco to the Caribbean and to France and other European countries. And so the southern colonies or states, we should say by this point, are supporting their economies by exports of cash crops largely. The northern colonies are a little more self-sufficient economically. They're struggling too with war and British incursions. But the southern colonies or states have really not had a lot of battles or action for several years.
Although action in the South was infrequent, early in the war, in 1776, the British launched an initial Southern campaign in the Carolinas because North and South Carolina were largely controlled by the revolutionaries, and the British wanted to take them back. Ultimately, the British efforts to recapture these rogue colonies failed, and the war shifted back to the north. And after years of war and hardship, the British were looking for ways to bring this conflict to a swift end.
So the British never thought it would last this long. The British, their home is 3,000 miles away. They're trying to maintain armies and communications and supply lines over the ocean. That's a challenge. The war has dragged on. They've been able to conquer and hold some territory in the north, but doing that hasn't ended the rebellion. So that's been frustrating. By 1778, other nations have joined in. They're piling on. Britain's old enemies, France and Spain and the Netherlands, will join in on the American side. Not all of them out of a love for the revolutionaries and the Americans. Self-interest. They see Britain struggling, and it's their chance to get revenge. So by 1778, 79, the British have bigger problems closer to home, and they really need to reorient and focus on defending Gibraltar, England itself. territories closer to, in Europe and Africa and Asia that they own. And finally, the British decide on a new strategy as they reorient to deal with their European enemies. The decision is made to scale down the war in North America and focus on the southern campaign, southern colonies, because it's thought there's a lot of loyalists, people who oppose the revolution. They want to stay loyal to England. And if they can recruit and use them, they can help wrap up the war in North America. So it's really counting on that loyal American support, which fails to really materialize in the way that they want it.
So we've got a Southern campaign on our hands. Beginning in 1780, the British pushed north from Georgia through the Carolinas, believing they could rally loyalist support and reclaim the South one colony at a time. That strategy ultimately brought the war to Virginia.
The British will launch the invasion going from south to north. So they will attack Georgia first, which is the weakest, to be blunt, weakest of the colonies, and it captures Savannah, puts in a new royal governor and a new British government. And so Georgia is basically conquered and reconstructed, if you will, for the British. They move on to South Carolina in 1780. They capture Charleston. And the fall of Charleston is a terrible defeat for the Americans. And actually, a lot of Virginia troops are captured there. Almost all of the Continental soldiers from Virginia, who were the veteran regular troops, are taken away at Charleston.
One often overlooked consequence of the fall of Charleston is that nearly all of Virginia's Continental soldiers were captured. Many spent the rest of the war imprisoned on notorious British prison ships, where disease and starvation were rampant. In fact, nearly a third of the captured soldiers never made it home.
With that loss, the British are able to move across South Carolina and pretty much take that over. But then they run into problems because the residents of the upper or back part of South Carolina, western part, are still pretty opposed to British rule and fight back with guerrilla warfare. And we start to see people emerge like Francis Marion and Andrew Pickens and Thomas Sumter. And they lead a guerrilla war, which will strike back and give the British problems.
If Patriots resisting the British in South Carolina sounds vaguely familiar, there's a chance you've seen a Hollywood version of it. The Patriot was inspired by the Battle of Waxhaw in South Carolina. In the movie, a peaceful farmer is pulled into the war after a brutal British attack on his family. While the characters are fictional, the film was inspired in part by the real-life Battle of Waxhaw, also known as Buford's Massacre, where British troops killed Patriot soldiers who were attempting to surrender. The event became a powerful rallying cry for the Patriot cause. Now we can hear about the real thing.
This is a really important engagement, even though it's small, because it sets the stage for a lot of things that are going to happen later. It's a small engagement in the upper part of South Carolina, near the North Carolina border, but basically a group of Virginia troops who are on the way to Charleston to help defend it. They're late, they're running behind, but they're marching down towards Charleston. The city's already been captured. The British send their cavalry forward to go after these Virginia troops who are arriving. The Virginia are commanded by an officer named Abram Buford, and he's a veteran officer. The British cavalry is commanded by Banastre Tarleton.
In the film, the brutal British Colonel Tavington is a heartless redcoat who takes no prisoners and even burns a church full of civilians. And while Tavington may be fiction, the character is loosely based on Colonel Tarleton and his actions at Waxhaw.
Tarleton is in his 20s. He's aggressive. He's good. He's hard-hitting, maybe a little rash sometimes. His cavalry will catch up to Buford's troops in a place called the Waxhaws. He demands the Americans surrender. They refuse. His cavalry gets ready to charge. The American troops will form up and prepare to defend themselves. The British will charge. And by the way, I'm saying British. A lot of Tarleton's people are American loyalists from the New York, New Jersey area who enlisted with the British. But The Americans are able to fire once before the British are on top of them. And in the confusion, Tarleton's horse is hit and he goes down. And his men become enraged because they think he's been wounded or killed. And this is where things get confusing. Battles are chaotic. And there are accounts, but it's difficult to piece it all together. Some of the Americans try to surrender. Some are still fighting. The British refuse to take prisoners for a while. Eventually they do, but it is pretty clear that a lot of the wounded and men trying to surrender are killed. So we do have an atrocity here. And in the aftermath, Tarleton has this reputation now of being brutal and refusing to accept prisoners, refusing to take men who are surrendering. And that's going to really be a rallying cry for the Americans in the upcoming battles like Kings Mountain and Cowpens that come a little later. Tarleton, I think, is a good officer who just got a little carried away, and those hard-hitting tactics are usually effective, but he was not able to learn to adjust as things needed to, because there's times when being too aggressive and impulsive is not good.
Today, Tarleton's reputation for brutality is sort of tangled up with his depiction in the film. Some historians aren't certain if he was truly as merciless as the colonel on the silver screen. The Patriot deviates from history, but it did get some things right. There were prisoners executed on both sides of the war. African Americans did participate in the conflict on both sides, and the war had a significant impact on civilians throughout the colonies. So the fighting in South Carolina continued. In August 1780, the Americans suffered one of their worst defeats of the war at the Battle of Camden. It was at Camden that General Horatio Gates hoped to repeat his success at Saratoga. Instead, he led the Continental Army into an absolute disaster. As his troops retreated, Gates fled the battlefield, riding nearly 200 miles in just 3 days, leaving behind his men and his shining legacy. The hero of Saratoga was accused of cowardice and quickly removed from command. British General Cornwallis was convinced that Patriot resistance in the South was on the verge of collapse, saying, "The rebel forces being at present dispersed, the internal commotion and insurrections in the province will now subside." But even in the face of this devastating loss, the Americans soon rallied with key victories at Kings Mountain, which was commanded by a Virginian and in which Virginia sent the most troops, marched the furthest, and suffered the most casualties, and at the Battle of Cowpens, commanded by another Virginian, Daniel Morgan.
Morgan specifically is important at the Battle of Cowpens, South Carolina, because he comes up with the plan that defeats Tarleton. And I think he uses Tarleton's aggressive nature against him to lure him into a trap, and Tarleton's troops are defeated. So Morgan's victory at Cowpens is extremely important. Cornwallis was very frustrated by that loss.
Cornwallis thought he had it in the bag after Camden, but the Americans persisted. After the victory at Cowpens, Daniel Morgan knew his men couldn't stay and fight. He led his exhausted troops into North Carolina to join General Nathanael Greene and the rest of the Continental Army, while staying just ahead of Cornwallis's pursuing forces. That chase ended at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15th, 1781.
Now, Guilford Courthouse, extremely important battle, largest Revolutionary War battle fought in North Carolina. March of 1781, the British have come up from South Carolina. They're hoping to conquer North Carolina. The Americans are trying to scrape together a new army because most of their troops, their veteran troops, have been captured at Charleston. So the American commander, Nathanael Greene, has some Virginia militia. He has some new Continental soldiers who've been recruited in Virginia. They're coming from the Petersburg area, moving down to North Carolina. He has some veteran Maryland and Delaware troops, and he has North and South Carolina militia. It's a hodgepodge. Some have experience, some don't. The British Army under Cornwallis, veteran troops. These are some tough guys. British troops, we have Scottish Highlanders, and some German Hessians. And they've been living off the land. They've been marching for weeks. And these two armies come together at a small community called Guilford Courthouse. It was the county seat. Basically, the battle plan is the Americans have 3 lines of defense. They put their weakest troops in front, North Carolina militia. Their job is to fire a few shots and then pull back. At the second line, you've got the Virginia militia, who are pretty experienced and pretty competent. And they're to fire a few shots and then pull back to the third line. And the third line is where the Continental soldiers, mostly Virginia, Maryland, Delaware troops who are very experienced, are supposed to hold the line and end the battle. So the idea is as the British advance, they take casualties, they push the Americans back, and they think that they're winning, but they're taking casualties and they're getting weaker until they come to that third line in the back. And at that point, hopefully they're out of gas and can't keep fighting. That's essentially what happens. The British push through that first line. The second line involves some heavy fighting with the Virginians, but the British break through. By the time they get to the third line, their troops are disorganized. They've taken casualties. A lot of leaders have been hit. And there's some very intense fighting on the third line, hand-to-hand combat.
One Virginian earned a legendary reputation for his efforts at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Peter Francisco, the Virginia Giant.
Peter Francisco is a fascinating person, and we don't know a lot about him, but he was an orphan who arrived in the Hopewell area and was adopted. So he spoke Portuguese. He was apparently brought over and abandoned. He's called the Giant. He was very tall for this time, I think over 6 feet tall, which would have been extremely large for a person at this time. During the Revolution, he is with the Virginia Cavalry, and he fights in many battles. At Guilford Courthouse, he is claimed to have killed 11 British soldiers by himself with his sword. After the Revolution, he lives here in Richmond and is Sergeant at Arms for the Masonic Hall, a member of the Masons. And the Masonic Hall is one of the older buildings here in Richmond with Revolutionary connections. He's a member there, buried at Shockoe Cemetery here in Richmond.
His actions have become the stuff of legend, but he was a real man who faced real action during the war. And his vest and his portrait, a miniature portrait of the Virginia Giant, are both in the VMHC collection. But back to the battle.
Eventually, British skill and experience prevail, and General Greene has to pull his army back. The battle lasts for about 3 to 4 hours. The British will lose over 500 men, quarter of their army. Terrible losses that they really can't afford. The American losses are higher, but a lot of the Americans have simply retreated and will come back to the army. They got scattered or retreated, and they'll rejoin the army later.
After the close fight, Morgan and Greene continued their retreat north, crossing into Virginia to join up with some fresh Virginia militia along the Dan River. With reinforcements finally arriving, the Americans were ready to turn and face Cornwallis once again.
So Guilford Courthouse is a British victory, absolutely, but comes at a really high cost. And at the end of the day, the British have occupied the ground, but they haven't defeated or destroyed the American army. They pushed it back, but they haven't destroyed it. And so it's frustrating for them. The war's going to continue.
So on paper, the British win, but they pay a heavy price, and the battle really doesn't help their efforts because their army is devastated. It's an important reminder that when we talk about victories and losses, it's not black and white. Every engagement is winnowing down manpower, gunpowder, and willpower. And especially in the case of the Revolution, it reaches a point where they have to decide if they can keep going. There's something to be said about not just outfighting, but outlasting the enemy.
In the case here, the British have about 2,000 men, and they're not getting any more. So every soldier who's killed, captured, sick or injured, is a subtraction. And as they move around the Carolinas and then into Virginia, they don't have a lot of people to work with, and the number is going to get smaller. And yes, you can win battles, but you can't win hearts and minds. You can't force the population against its will. And that's what they're running into. The important thing to keep in mind with the whole Southern campaign is this was England's last effort to end the war. It's becoming unpopular at home. It's politically not sustainable. So we have to look at it from that point of view. The British have shifted most of their military resources to fighting their European enemies. So the army that's left in North America is small. It's got to do what it can without any help, and they're trying to rely on American loyalists. And this is their last effort to end the war. The British really realize that they may not get everything they want here in North America. In the meantime, the main British army moves into Virginia because Virginia is the source of supplies and troops for the Southern effort for the Americans. And the British general Cornwallis knows that, so he really wants to conquer Virginia and knock it out of the war.
Virginia had already been preparing for that possibility. In 1780, Governor Thomas Jefferson moved the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, a more central and defensible location that, unlike Williamsburg, had fewer loyalist ties. But the move didn't keep the British away. On New Year's Day, 1781, turncoat Benedict Arnold sailed up the James River with about 800 men. En route to Richmond, Benedict Arnold stops at Westover Plantation, located along the James River, and the home of Mary Willing Byrd, his wife's cousin. He uses this plantation as a location to stage his men before the march to Richmond, and drags Mary Byrd into a whole lot of trouble along the way. To learn more about her story, you can go back and listen to episodes from season 2.
I think something interesting about Arnold, when Benedict Arnold attacks Richmond in 1781, he knows he's a wanted man. He knows he cannot be captured because the Americans are going to hang him. They don't want to make an example of him. So when he gets up the river, he's not even sure he wants to go to attack Richmond, but his second in command says, we've come this far, let's go ahead and do it. Because Arnold doesn't want to get too far into enemy territory. But the other part of that is Arnold's second in command, who's named John Simcoe, has secret orders to arrest Arnold if he does anything funny. The British don't trust him either. So Simcoe knows that he can, anytime he wants, he can take over. Arnold never knew that.
By January 4th, he reached Richmond, where just 200 Virginia militia stood in his way. The outnumbered defenders fired a single ineffective volley and scattered. Jefferson ordered an emergency evacuation of military supplies and government records before fleeing the city himself.
The British will target Richmond first in January 1781. That's when Benedict Arnold, who is now wearing a British uniform, comes to town. It's his first action as a British officer. And I think he wanted to prove himself. He just switched sides. So in January 1781, Arnold leads about 800 men. They come up the James River, land at Westover, march into Richmond. There's a skirmish on the hill where Chimborazo, the National Park Visitor Center, is. The British capture Richmond. They stay for 24 hours, destroy a lot of supplies, an iron foundry, naval supplies, tobacco, things like that. Then they leave.
So Arnold entered Richmond virtually unopposed and quickly demanded the city's tobacco and military supplies from Jefferson and businesses in the city. The VMHC has a letter from Benedict Arnold dated January 5th, 1781, demanding the owners of tobacco, rum, wine, sugar, molasses, sailcloth, and coffee in Richmond and Manchester deliver their goods at half price to the British Army. Refused by Jefferson, Arnold ordered the city burned. His troops set fire to public buildings, homes, and businesses before moving on. While Jefferson has been criticized for not doing more to defend the capital, he did ultimately call upon the Virginia militia to drive out Arnold. A quick reminder, the reason he had to go the militia route, groups of local citizen soldiers who defend their communities and aren't usually sent very far away, is because most of Virginia's Continental soldiers were either captured at Charleston or serving elsewhere in the South. The Virginia militia ultimately found and fought against Arnold and helped force his move back to Portsmouth. The attack on Richmond had come to an end, but the British campaign in Virginia was far from over. The next target was Petersburg. While most people associate Petersburg with the Civil War, in 1781, it was equally important to the Revolution. It served as a major supply depot and recruiting center for the Continental Army, where troops were assembled and provisions were gathered before being sent south.
General Cornwallis commands the British Army, and he's got about 2,000 or so men, and they are coming up from the south. They enter Virginia. They come up to Petersburg. By this point, the Americans are trying to scrape together a defense of the state. And General von Steuben, famous for his work at Valley Forge, has been sent to Virginia by General Washington to help organize the Virginia militia. That doesn't go well. Von Steuben was, I think, maybe difficult to get along with, and there is the language barrier. He doesn't speak much English. But von Steuben commands the Virginia militia, and they organize a small defense at Petersburg. And we're talking, Petersburg was very small. So it's what's now Old Town Petersburg, the very center of the city. The Americans fight. They get pushed back towards the Appomattox River. They make a final stand, and then they cross to the other side where Colonial Heights is today. And the British will occupy Petersburg, capture supplies, destroy what they can. And then they will also move over to the James River and destroy an American naval force on the James River at a place called Osborne Landing. So they cause a lot of destruction. This is April 1781. The British, by the way, they try to go on to capture Richmond again, but General Lafayette has arrived and has troops in Richmond to defend it. So the British decide not to attack. But they do fire artillery back and forth across the river from Manchester to the Richmond side of the river. So through the summer of 1781, the British moved far and wide across Virginia because most of the Virginia Continental troops were captured at Charleston. They marched around the state. They moved through Henrico and Hanover County up towards Spotsylvania. They launched a big cavalry raid out to the west towards Charlottesville. The state legislature has left Richmond and moved to Charlottesville for safety. The British barely missed capturing Jefferson at Monticello. Literally, they're coming up the hill as he departs.
One Virginia man made a big difference here, Jack Jouett. Jack Jouett was a private citizen who is basically Virginia's Paul Revere. He learns that the British were coming for Charlottesville, and he rides through the night to sound the alarm. At this point, the British are legitimately all over the state of Virginia.
And by 1781, Virginia is pretty worn out. It sent a lot of its men and material out of the state for years, supporting troops and things in the north and in the deep south. So Virginia doesn't have much left to give by 1781. The economy's collapsed. Inflation, shortages, all that kind of stuff. And a good parallel might be to think of the late war for the Civil War when the Confederate economy starts to collapse and civilian morale starts to collapse. So the British move across Virginia. They can go anywhere they want. They captured Petersburg. They captured Richmond. The main British headquarters is in New York City, which they've held since early in the war. And Cornwallis gets orders from his superior in New York to move down to the peninsula and find a port to occupy, because his troops will be either evacuated or reinforced. So Cornwallis moves the British Army. They come through Richmond. They march down Williamsburg. There's a skirmish at a place called Green Springs, which is near Jamestown. Just a skirmish. the Americans are pursuing them under Lafayette. Lafayette and von Steuben command the troops that are trying to defend Virginia. The British will actually move down to the Hampton Roads area, but then come back up to Yorktown. And they dig in to await help from New York. Washington and his French ally, General Rochambeau, see an opportunity. At this time, the main American and French armies are in New York, Connecticut. And this is incredible, but they decide to march them, mostly march, some movement by sea, from there down to Virginia, 500 miles. By late September, the American and French armies are closing in on the British at Yorktown. So as this British force under Cornwallis fight these battles, like we talked about, Guilford Courthouse, and the actions here in Virginia, and they win a lot of them, but it's not enough to crush the American war effort. It's able to keep going.
By the fall of 1781, Cornwallis found himself cornered and besieged in Yorktown, Virginia. We'll pick up that story next time in our season finale. Thanks to Bert Dunkerley for sharing his insights on the Southern campaign on today's episode.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Revolution Revisited is a production of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Our production staff includes Haley Finner, Maggie Creech, Nicole Martorana, and Tracy Schneider. Be sure to subscribe to get notified about upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.